Domestic violence support services say lockdowns are creating pressure cooker environments at home, with an increasing number of women and children seeking help. According to new data provided exclusively to The Drum, more than 2/3 of service providers in New South Wales are reporting an increase in demand for their services. The state's peak body, Domestic Violence New South Wales, says waitlists are getting longer and the sources of conflict more complex. The Drum's Stephanie Bolchi has this story.
The southwest of Sydney remains under a strict lockdown and families are crying out for emotional and financial support. But services are also seeing women increasingly seek help for family violence via phone as well as Facebook and Instagram.
The cases are very severe. Mental abuse, physical abuse, all of the financial abuse, and she is about to have a baby with no support whatsoever. That is the severity that I'm talking about.
Muslim Women Australia's Linking Heart service has had to house some women in hotels.
Crisis accommodation have been literally all filled because you have to test. You've got to worry about the ones, the family that already exist in the crisis service. Transitional homes are all filled up. There's no spaces left. There's no affordable housing available.
But it's not just in the southwest where the calls for help are on the rise. 57 service providers across New South Wales say they've seen an increase since the lockdown began in June.
I think the psychological and physical impacts are simply taking their toll this time. We've got these new disaster payments, but our services are telling us that individuals are really struggling to access those disaster payments.
The restrictions that have been put in place to keep people safe and healthy are also putting some people at risk, particularly women and children that are experiencing domestic violence.
Baptist Care Hope Street provides a range of support, including food packages as well as housing, counselling and casework. They're among the 84% of the providers that said the types of issues are more complex this lockdown.
There's an increase in all types of violence, but particularly that coercive control and intimidation of having a perpetrator in the house much more regularly than usual. The pressures around homeschooling and working from home as well adds to that complexity.
Nearly half of the services surveyed have longer waitlist times, and about a quarter of specialist workers say they're struggling with the high demand.
One of our services tells us that 1 in 2 clients are turned away.
Equally, though, it is the people they're not hearing from that remains a big concern, and providers are preparing for an influx post-lockdown.
To tell us more, we're joined by Associate Professor of Clinical and Forensic Psychology at Swinburne University, Troy McEwen. Welcome back to The Drum.
Thanks very much.
Now, to hear that there's an increase in the complexity of abuse is very difficult to actually fathom, given how complicated it is already. What does this mean for police and for service providers?
Well, I mean, what your story there has showed is very similar to what we observed in Victoria last year with the extended lockdown here. Essentially, what we saw in Victoria was, I think, a reflection of the fact that a lot of the things that drive exacerbations in family violence and worsening incidents are to do with immediate stress. They're the things that trigger. They're not the big, broad causes of family violence, but they're in the moment. The triggers are things to do with stress. And I think what we're seeing is that the reality is that Australia is pretty stressed right now, and lots of people who may have had some ability to cope more effectively with that or deal more effectively with that have lost that in the current environment. And so I think that's really a big part of what's happening. I know from some of the work that I've done here in Victoria that, the severity of call-outs for police, just anecdotally, was considered to be much, much higher during the extended lockdown we had. And I don't know now if that's happening again, but I wouldn't be shocked. You've really got people who are kind of at the end of their tether. If you think about everything that's happening in the world right now and all the kind of stresses and threats that are out there, and then you take all the financial stress that's happening, as was said, the kids at home and just inability to get away from each other, and you put that into a relationship or a family that's already struggling. And unfortunately, this is some of the result that you see.
And we're having a lot of conversations about coercive control. Our researchers are, advocates are, legislators are. There's been a New South Wales committee looking at it. And we hear that this is what is particularly a problem when people are locked in together, that kind of controlling behaviour, and especially if you don't have access to information or to technology. What then is what then can the providers do to help in that scenario, or even people around those who might be at risk?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't provide service to victims of family violence, and so I'm not going to try and tell them their job.
Sure.
But certainly listening, obviously, everything that you would usually want people to do with family violence, as hard as it is right now, we've got to do that more. We've got to listen more frequently, to listen more closely. We've got to reach out harder. We've got to be more willing, perhaps, to report things. And perhaps other times we go, oh, I'll wait till I'll see them. I'll wait till I'll have a chat in person with my friend. Actually, maybe you just need to do something, because the reality is things are more severe right now. So I think pick up the phone call, look at the website, get some information, and if you're really concerned about people whether that's family or friends, say something to somebody. Don't think that it'll just go away or that you're just imagining things.
And it is primarily the stress of the lockdown combined with financial uncertainty and everything being exacerbated, all the fault lines during this time. Is that what's going on?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, look, I think it's got to be a big part of it. I mean, there's lots of things that cause family violence, right? Lots of complicated things, as you've already referenced, and you obviously know this, and all the things in society and the structures that cause it. But in the day-to-day moments, it's things about the individual and what they believe and how well they're coping with their emotions. I mean, I work with people who use violence within their families, and the challenges and the difficulties those people experience, and this is not an excuse, it's an explanation, the difficulties those people experience managing their emotions, you've now just kind of put a bunch more water in that bucket for them, because of this whole environment and all the stresses that come with it. And that, again, it's not an excuse, but it's a way of understanding why this might be happening. It's not necessarily because people want to be worse, although some people do. But those stresses that we're all experiencing, when you have a tendency towards using abusive or violent behaviour in your family, when you have stress on top of that, that plays out even more so.
Now, Amani, you've written a really powerful, it's kind of stunning memoir about the death of your mother at the hands of your father and the impact on you and the trauma that you carried with you from your mother and your grandmother. I want to talk about that in a moment, but when you hear about this, about the statistics and about what happens in this kind of pressure cooker environment of lockdown, do you shudder at the thought when you think about your mother having been in a situation like that?
Yeah, of course. I sit on the board at the Bankstown Women's Health Centre in the Bankstown Canterbury LGA, and we're hearing the same thing in terms of what women are reporting, what's being said to the service. And to give a bit of a picture of what's going on the ground, I spoke to our CEO today, and they've had to extend their food share service 5 days a week instead of one, and do mental health checkups for clients of the service. And that's on top of service delivery relating to DV and the increasingly complicated DV issues that are being reported to the service right now. They've also mentioned to me that there's a new cohort of women reporting violence to the service who had not previously approached for services in the past. There is, as we heard in the previous report, a limit in terms of what housing is available for women in crisis. So basically everyone in the sector is treading water at the moment, trying to support families with basic needs, as well as navigating really complicated issues that predate the pandemic. And for me, as someone who's experienced this from a lived experience perspective, I think it's really important that we pay attention to those nuances and to the way that environmental and social factors play into women's lives and how it affects their decision making and their safety planning.
Tell us why you wanted to tell this story about your mother.
Well, it all kind of started at around the time of my father's trial. So it took about 2 years between the murder and the trial itself, which is a really long time to wait for any kind of decision or closure or to kind of start building your life again. I hung a lot of hopes on what the legal system might be able to do for my family, and I was really hopeful that it would capture the complex experiences that my mum had, as well as who she was as a person and how much she actually suffered in her experience of abuse. And at the end of that process, I wasn't quite convinced that we'd covered all of those different aspects of her life, and was left feeling a little bit disappointed by the focus of the criminal justice system. And perhaps that was a little bit naive of me. I was a lawyer, and I had practiced a lot in courtrooms and really saw this as a forum for storytelling and truth-telling. After having my own really re-traumatizing experience of sitting in court and giving evidence and giving a victim impact statement, I started to think about where else and how else I could tell my mum's story and do justice to her and honour her life and share my grandmother's story. My grandmother was killed in an Israeli drone strike in 2006 in South Lebanon. So that was another trauma that my family had endured. And in honouring both of their lives, it felt really important to me to capture what they'd been through, how that had affected the family, and how my sisters and I have gone on to heal from that, as well as some of the barriers that have stood in our way during that process.
Yeah, it's such an important point to make, and I think a lot of people don't fully understand what you're saying about, you know, how trauma passes down through generations. And you begin your story by telling you how you were giving birth and thinking of your mother and you felt too sad to push. Can you tell us how is that carried in you? Like when you say you feel that the trauma of your grandmother and of your mother, how does that play out in your life, kind of physically and psychologically?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting thing that we don't talk about enough. And intergenerational trauma is experienced by lots of communities where mothers have had their lives disrupted by a traumatic experience that then they have to learn how to cope with and manage and then mother their own children through that experience. And that creates an environment where you're at risk of passing on particular behaviours or poor coping mechanisms to your children. So when I lost my mum and I remembered the grief of losing my grandmother in that moment, I couldn't help but link those two things and really develop an appreciation for how resilient and how strong my mum was to give birth to us, firstly, in a foreign country away from her own family, and then raise us before then pursuing a career of her own and an education of her own. And I wanted to highlight that resilience in spite of all that trauma and look at what can I do to also build that in my own life and put a stop to this sort of cycle of violence that at times feels really inescapable. And in becoming a mother myself, I was really prompted to consider what my role would be, how I would tell that story and honour it, and what I would pass on to my own children.
And you've already done so much, Amani. You've told this story. You did a portrait of your mother, which was shortlisted for the Archibald, The Mother Wound. There it is now. Incredibly beautiful art. And now this memoir, I know you're going to be flooded with people coming to tell you their stories after all of this as well. Catherine, I know that the idea of like trauma passed down through generations is not a novel one to you. But so much of what we're dealing with right now in this crisis mode is at the pointy end. There never seem to be enough resources. There never seems to be enough. We can hear about all the work that Armani's doing. We can hear people from Baptist Care. Where do you think the kind of need lies? What are you hearing from the families you speak to?
Look, all of the community services that we support are saying the same thing, and it backs up what Armani was saying. This predates COVID. These resources were already stretched, and it's because at this moment in time the majority of funding in this space goes to the tertiary end. There is very little in the primary end that targets early interventions that supports people before they're in trouble. Most people know that there's something going wrong, but the ability to reach out, where is the information, where are the barriers to access, all of those sorts of things, they're really, really complicated. And at this moment in time, certainly our services are saying exactly the same thing, that communities are under extreme stress and extreme vulnerability, and there is no way to get those assertive interventions in place. The ability to go out and touch base with people, are you okay? And I don't know, I think one of the things I know in growing up is, and this one bugs me to this day, and I don't get it, is I don't understand why other people don't pick up the phone. With all the messaging, with all the distress and all the trauma, I've never understood why people next door don't pick up the phone and report it, because you know what, someone always knows that that's happening.
Do you think that's important to do, Armani?
Yeah, I think it's really important to challenge the idea of being a passive bystander. I'm conscious of the fact that there are people who don't trust police intervention, but I think in a lot of these situations, it's not really about that. It's about people who are too uncomfortable to intervene, who think of domestic violence as a private issue between two people, who basically want to put their head in the sand and not be responsible for their neighbour. And I think we really do need to resist that way of living. We live in a hyper-individualised society. Women are isolated. Migrant women experience intense isolation that contributes to their experiences of abuse and their inability to even form connections with people who can extend compassion or empathy towards them. And it's essential that we be vigilant neighbours and we do get involved in our neighbours' lives and not be bystanders when we witness or hear violence happening next door.
Yeah, I'm really struck by one commonality of a lot of stories I hear of people who drive past a man being violent to a woman on the street. Now, we know that domestic violence mostly happens in the home, and the physical component is not always there, physical abuse, but it's often part of it. But they often say, oh, I didn't want to interrupt because I thought it was just a relationship or they were having some kind of domestic dispute. Do you think we've gone past that now, John? Hopefully we have, but I've been in the media for a long time, and we've talked about, you know, trying to actually not leave it behind the front door and be more active in our own communities, and seems we've got a long way to go in relation to that. And just this conversation we've had here, there's a word that sort of stuck out in the report and the comments, waitlist, where you hear people being turned away, and I think, where are they going to go? And they're in this climate where they're being told, you have to stay home, don't leave home, and they imagine what that's like in the present climate, to make that move, and then you're told, oh, there isn't anywhere for you. Where do they go? Yeah. What do we... And
I'll just add to that, actually, in terms of waitlisting, because it's actually not just for, and obviously it's in some ways more important for people who are victims of violence, but actually it's equally as problematic for people who want to access help to not use violence. The wait lists for behaviour change programs and for help for people perpetrating violences are equally as bad, and so we're not responding to either end of it. No. You know. Yeah, right, and it's always difficult because you need the emergency accommodations.
But in the end, governments are trying to deal with so many different things right now. But this seems to me, we talk about the consequences of the lockdowns. This would have to be near the front, wouldn't it? In terms of trying
when you talk about jostling priorities, I mean, Troy, can you tell me what the percentage is of police work that is occupied with domestic violence? It's, you know, almost half of all police work, right?
Yeah, it's exactly.
Higher in some
it's an enormous percentage. It's higher depending on where you are. It's higher, but it's certainly the majority of assaults that police deal with. These kinds of things, they're related to family violence. It's absolutely endemic. It's essentially the core of police work.
See, that's what makes me think.
In Australia, so.
Yeah, that's what makes me think why is that not a priority? If we have one crime that was occurring more than any other in every state and territory in the country. But Neela, often these come into the medical system as well, right? You're often repairing the abuse. What does it mean for you? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. You know, we saw this in the long Melbourne lockdown last year, is the instance of injuries that were claimed to be accidental, but, you know, as clinicians you can look at it, you can look at the pattern of injury and you can say this doesn't look accidental, this looks non-accidental, this looks inflicted. you know, that's something that we have to deal with. And the emergency department, the operating theatre is not necessarily the place where we can fix these things. You know, it is an opportunity to intervene. It's an opportunity to, you know, reassure predominantly women that that seeking care for this is appropriate, that there are services available. But, you know, as we've heard, you know, ad nauseum tonight, these services are so stretched. And, you know, the lockdown also interferes with our ability to intervene proactively. You know, for example, schools being closed. You know, school is such a place of refuge for children who come from families where violence is a daily act. Right. And so that oversight of, you know, not just the oversight of teachers to making sure that they're safe, but that emotional support that schools can provide is absent as well. And so you have these families who are very alone in their distress and trauma, and quite separated, even more so from the rest of society, which makes it very hard for even interactions with the health system to intervene effectively at that point.
Well, Amani, I hope everyone reads your book. It's such an important story, and it's so beautifully told. And Troy, we really appreciate you bringing your expertise to our viewers on the drum again. Thank you, Troy.
No worries,
Troy McEwen is an Associate Professor of Clinical and Forensic Psychology at Swinburne University. If you've been affected by anything we've been discussing, call Lifeline 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732.